Thank you so much, Leanne, and a warm welcome to everyone again. Thanks so much for joining us here today for the report launch of GrowAsia's first Gender Mainstreaming in Agricultural Value Chains in Southeast Asia report. I am joined today by my colleague, Leanne Chua, who is an associate here at GrowAsia, and you will be hearing from her again later in the webinar as we move ahead with our agenda. Just a quick overview. We'll be doing a short welcome and introduction of GrowAsia for those who might not be familiar with us. Then I'll move into sharing with you the report highlights and the findings from the case studies within that report. We're then very pleased to be joined by 4 experts from our case studies that we feature in the report. They'll be sharing with you details about how they design the programs and the business case for working on gender mainstreaming. And then at the end, we'll be saving time to share with you the recommendations from the report for the GrowAsia network. And we look forward to an interactive roundtable discussion with all of you at that point. So I'll be encouraging you to unmute yourselves and to share your thoughts in the chat box. And then just before we sign off, we'll give you the link to the report. So just before we get started, I'd love to find out who is in the room with us here today. So you'll see a poll up on your screen. If everyone can take just 5 seconds to fill out what type of organization you represent, and then hit the submit button at the bottom. And this will just give all of us a sense of who's joining us here today. And for our panelists to perhaps also be able to target their comments and their responses to your questions. I think we can go ahead and share the results. Fantastic. So it looks like the most represented here today with us are from the private sector at 20% and from our NGO, CSO, and academia partners at 44%, but a very warm welcome again to all of you. Just a few housekeeping notes. If you're having any technical issues during the webinar, you can try first logging off and then back on, but you can also send a private message directly to the GrowAsia name that you'll see in the participant box, and they will help you. Please also make sure that you rename yourself under the More button so that you can add your organization name. It makes it a bit more friendly with everyone else here on the webinar today. And then use the Q&A box at the bottom to ask questions to the speakers when we get to the panel session. And just to let you know, a recording of the webinar and copy of the slides will be made available to you afterwards. I'd like to get started by just sharing with you a little bit about how GrowAsia got to this point of launching this report with you here today. For those who are not familiar with us, GrowAsia's mission is to improve smallholder farmers' productivity, profitability, and environmental sustainability across Southeast Asia. And we do this using a dual approach. We have 6 in-country teams, which we call country partnerships, that are responsible for building up teams of partners, of private sector, public sector, and producer sector partners who design interventions to support those smallholder farmers in country. And I can imagine that many of you here with us today are members of those country partnerships. Then we also have our regional programs, and those apply across Southeast Asia, and most are managed out of our office here in Singapore, including our work on gender mainstreaming, which is new to us this year. Again, just to share that in our focus on impacting smallholder farmers, we have grown from being able to reach about 500,000 smallholder farmers when GrowAsia was founded in 2015, all the way to 1.8 million smallholder farmers at the end of 2019, and we're waiting for those figures from 2020. But one thing that we've noticed is that we are still not always clear out of this number of farmers, how many of them are women, and then what are the unique barriers and opportunities that those women are facing, and how can we help our partners be more prepared to meet their unique needs. So back in 2017 and 2018, we held several roundtables on women's empowerment with our partners. We gathered inputs from our country partnerships in the 6 countries in an effort to develop a network-wide gender mainstreaming strategy in 2019. And this was very much in response to interest and indicators from both our 520 members and partners, as well as our donors and international organizations moving the conversation forward on gender mainstreaming. Then last year, we officially completed our 2-year gender mainstreaming strategy, and we included a monitoring and evaluation framework so that Grow Asia can see our progress as we move forward. Then by December of last year, we had conducted this gender mainstreaming mapping report together with Business for Social Responsibility, or BSR, who were our consultants on this report. And that's what we're thrilled to share with you today. Our target impact in this gender mainstreaming strategy is that through Grow Asia's regional, country level, and working group level interventions, projects, and partnerships, we can embed a gender consciousness into our approach to agricultural development and amplify the business case for women's empowerment among our partners to actually incentivize investment in gender inclusive actions, practices, and policies here in Southeast Asia. So I'd like to dive into the report with you now. I imagine that many of you on the call today are probably in some way, shape, or form very familiar with the landscape of women farmers and women in agricultural businesses and organizations here in Southeast Asia. So I'll just do a very brief overview for those who might be less familiar and then jump directly into the report. So I'm sure many of you know, women comprise up to 50% of the agricultural labor force in Southeast Asian countries, much more depending on which country we're talking about. Globally, women receive only 5% of agricultural extension services, according to the UN FAO. That number is a bit low, but what we do know is that when both women and men receive training, productivity can increase by as much as 131%. We also know that there's a wide yield gap between male and women farmers. And if we were able to actually increase output and yield by women farmers, we could raise output globally by 4%, which then of course has a positive impact on food security at a global scale. What we also know is that assumptions hinder the impact that we're able to have on these women. So we know that, again, globally, women face structural challenges, as well as sociocultural and political challenges, such as not being involved in decision-making on the farm, having less access to land, resources such as inputs, finance, education, and mobile technology. We also know that these experiences are not homogeneous and vary widely across Asia Pacific. And you'll actually be able to see in the report a breakdown of the gender gap analysis conducted by the World Economic Forum in the 6 countries where Grow Asia operates. So you can look forward to checking that out. I'll also like to add here that we know that many of the programs aimed at supporting women in agri-value chains do benefit some, but also can have a negative impact when they cause unintended consequences for other women. This might look like when we bring a technology to women such as a weed cutter, and it makes their productivity, or it improves their efficiency, but then we also realize that it's taking away jobs from an agricultural labor force that may be less educated in the surrounding area as a result of the introduction of that technology. So we have to be aware of the ways in which these decisions impact smallholder farmer communities and the women surrounding them. In Southeast Asia specifically, and again, this comes out in the report, our consultants found that there were 3 overarching challenges that women face, and then the last 3 are ongoing challenges that we see globally. So number 1, of course, the challenge of access to education, information, and trainings. 2 is the lack of access to finance and resources. 3, cultural and social norms. So we do still see in some countries and communities that women are seen as important in roles of caretakers and in family matters, but not in terms of being able to actually make decisions about the farm as a business or about the household finances. We also know that women in general face lower opportunities for downstream participation, such as marketing, trading, and sales. So then they're also prevented from being able to move up in their skills. Because women are still expected to do many of these household and family duties, they face significant time and mobility burdens in terms of their ability to actually travel, to perhaps work on farms that are further away from the home, or to work in processing facilities. And then lastly, just a reminder that there is a tendency to consider women as a homogeneous group, but in fact, we have to understand not only the dynamics that women face in different countries here in Southeast Asia, but also in very specific provinces, districts, and small-scale communities. So the purpose of our gender landscape mapping report was, one, to disseminate learnings and best practices from our network, from our private, public, and producer sector partners. And then two, to identify strategic areas of action for GrowAsia to positively impact gender equality in our region. And that will be in the second half of today's webinar when we present those recommendations to you and ask for your feedback on them. As I mentioned, we were thrilled to be working with Business for Social Responsibility, or BSR, on this report. They did a desktop review of the barriers, trends, and opportunities that I just shared with you. Then they conducted interviews with 15 of our partners who agreed to share their experiences in developing and maintaining gender mainstreaming programs, both at the organization level and also within their value chains and in individual farmer communities. BSR then conducted desktop research to correlate what we know from our research partners together with the findings of the interviews. And then lastly, BSR used feedback from those interviews, as well as many conversations with the GrowAsia staff around the region, to identify recommendations for the network. And I would like to just add here that what we found in these 15 conversations, and then when we compared it to the existing research, is that there are some discrepancies. And we realize, again, that this is why it's so important to design interventions that are specifically focused for certain sociocultural groups or for a geographic scope, in order to really understand what women's unique challenges and needs are. I'd like to take a moment to thank the participants who engaged with us during this interview process. So at the M&C level, we had Bayer Crop Science, East West Seed, Golden Agri Resources, Mars, and Nestle. Our local companies, which operate at a domestic or regional level in our GrowAsia country partnerships, we have Simmery Group, Kirarom Food Production, Natural Agriculture Village, and Sasa International. And then lastly, we had a group of CSOs, NGOs, as well as international organizations and government-sponsored programs. We had ACAR, we had GIZ, the GREAT Program, PRISMA, SNV in Vietnam, and Swiss Contact. And again, many thanks to all of the staff and consultants from these organizations that contributed their insights during this process. And what we've all been waiting for, the high-level findings from the gender landscape mapping report. Again, the report itself goes into much more detail than what I'll share with you here today, but I want to give you a sense of our findings so that that informs the questions that you can ask to our panelists, as well as the feedback that you give us on our recommendations toward the end of the webinar. As I mentioned previously, we found that many organizations looked both at the organizational level, so within their own organization or corporate structure, as well as at the value chain level. So at the organization level, we found some differences between our NGO and international organization partners, as well as the companies that we spoke to. We found that NGOs tend to establish organization-wide policies on specific issues, such as gender balance and targets for leadership. And then we find that with M&Cs, they also implement gender equality policies across all of their operations, perhaps because they have greater resources to do so. Then when we look at our domestic and SME partners, we often found that it's someone or a few people in senior leadership roles that are promoting gender equality and realize that they've actually taken huge steps in moving toward greater gender equality in policies for their organization without necessarily having those policies be formalized. We also heard from our interviews that there were some barriers to being able to implement gender mainstreaming at an organizational level, such as a lack of implementation after the policies are put in place, sometimes less support from senior leadership, or a lack of incentive to actually implement those changes. So I will share barriers with you now, but directly after this, I'll share the exciting and fantastic work that our partners are already doing. At the value chain level, we found that our NGO and international organization partners' interventions focused primarily on promoting women's agency and ability to make decisions for themselves, as well as upskilling them so that they could participate in more of those downstream activities and access additional stages in the supply chain. Our company partners, we found that their interventions occur mostly through training programs, as well as other very creative ways to engage women farmers. We also found that our SME partners specifically can respond quite quickly to individual needs of their farmers or of the factory workers that they employ, because as a smaller operation, they're able to very easily understand and then respond to those challenges that women bring to them. Again, the barriers that we see, that the value for business development might not be clear, and that can be challenging when you're trying to get sales and procurement teams on board with a new project or program in the value chain. We see a lack of training for field level teams about gender sensitivity and gender mainstreaming, so they may not be aware of some of the policies that the organization has when they're going out to deliver those trainings to women in the field. And then lastly, and this is an ongoing challenge that we've heard from our partners during this process and others, that sometimes there's a lack of understanding about how organizations should be engaging men in their programs as well. And a few of the organizations that we included in our interviews did give us some ideas and best practices to do that. We noticed a series of common interventions, both at the organization and at the value chain level among the partners we interviewed. So at the organization level, we saw several organizations providing direct support to mothers returning to work in the form of childcare, pumping rooms, or even on-site childcare facilities. We saw a promotion of entrepreneurship within the organization for women who work there, and really encouraging that sense of business development within the women. We saw that these organizations are addressing cultural norms that limit women's participation in leadership. So again, these kind of pervasive beliefs that show that women are meant to work out of the home instead of going out to work at a nearby factory or processing facility. And then lastly, we saw that a few of the interviewees shared that they are setting targets for gender inclusion, perhaps at an organization level, at a company level, or across all the operations around the world in the case of our multinational partners. And that's very exciting to see. On the value chain side, we saw a strong commonality with this idea of using women as the agents to actually directly sell products to their communities, to fellow women and men farmers. We also saw that they make fantastic trainers themselves, and that women farmers may be much more likely to attend a training that's led by a woman. We also see an example with Nestle out of the Philippines focused on coffee ambassadors, where again, they use a train the trainer model to actually inform women and then send them back into the community to help teach these best practices on coffee farms. Several of the companies that we interviewed use gender and farmer committees as a way to understand and mitigate some of the challenges that women are facing. So these committees are formed, and then women are actually able to bring up grievances and challenges that they're facing, maybe related to health and safety or security at their jobs, or perhaps in terms of community level decision making. So we saw that our partner Golden Agri, as well as the Natural Agricultural Village, both have set up these types of committees for the farmers that they work with. We also see a trend in many of our organizational partners working directly with community leaders who then help our partners identify the best location for demo farms or trainings, as well as the best time and incentives to get women to be able to attend, because those community leaders know what kinds of challenges women are facing. And then lastly, again, we saw this theme where our partners are trying to understand how to engage men in this idea of letting go of some of those sociocultural barriers for women, but also making sure that men and women are working together to improve their livelihoods across the board. It's essential, as we learned from these interviews, to understand what the business case outcomes of these interventions would be. So the first one is, of course, seeing positive return on investment and revenue generation. This might be because as more women are brought in as sales agents, they are also then bringing greater number of women to purchase or to use a particular set of inputs, or to purchase dairy products in the case of our partner Simmery in Indonesia. We also see that there's, at the organizational level, an opportunity to increase organizational performance and external reputation. And this, of course, leads to increased productivity and efficiency within the organization itself. And then lastly, there's a business case for mitigating risk. We heard from one of our partners that as a result of providing on-site trainings to their women employees, they then found that the women themselves were more likely to send their children to school, and then that reduces the risks of child labor, as an example. We also saw an enormous trend that all of the organizations that we talked to are partnering in some way with either together an NGO and a company, or a company, an NGO, and a research organization to implement these programs. We also see that research organizations are essential in providing tested and proven practices and supporting companies to adopt those best practices. We see that there are trainings on agronomic practices that are very well established as a result of these partnerships. But we also heard that there's a need for more partnership in areas such as providing trainings on financial literacy, which might be an area that some of our organizations do not have as much expertise. And so that's really an area of opportunity for the Grow Asia Network. And then two areas that we noticed had fewer references and or areas that our partners told us were very real challenges. The first one, of course, is the ability to influence public policy and to share these learnings that are happening at the ground in value chain projects with policymakers to actually be able to make a real shift and difference. But we also know that in many cases, the department or ministry that's responsible for agriculture is not in communication with the ministries that might be responsible for women and children, for example. So that's an ongoing barrier. And then the second area of opportunity is being able to measure both progress in terms of not only how many women are participating in these programs, but also the impact, which is how have women's incomes increased and changed? Have women been able to send their children to school, etc.? I won't take time to go over these tools, but I'm sharing them here with you today. And just a reminder that we will share the slides with you after this webinar. So you'll be able to explore some of the tools for impact measurement that our partners are using or recommend to us. So I'd now like to take just a few minutes before we move on to our panel discussion to share with you 3 case studies that you'll be able to find in the report. And these case studies are of the partners who were generous enough to join us and share on the panel. Again, we're very grateful to every organization who shared their insights with us, and we wish we had enough time to hear from all of them, but we will use these case studies as illustrative examples. The first is Mars's Cocoa for Generations strategy. So they have field programs both in Africa as well as Indonesia, and they establish partnerships with NGOs to implement these farm level programs. They also use a research-based approach to understand the behaviors, attitudes, and experiences of women cocoa farmers. Faye will go into more detail here, but there is very clearly a business case for the Cocoa for Generations strategy, including diversifying and creating stability of the cocoa supply. And some key considerations in this project that Mars has identified: the need to be aware of existing inequalities women face in cocoa communities, being able to identify the right partners and suppliers to address women's barriers, and then linking the program to the organizational level international sustainability strategy so that the learnings that are happening on the ground are going up to actually contributing directly to that strategy. The next is our partner East West Seeds Knowledge Transfer Program, which is actually a nonprofit arm of the organization. Their field program occurs in multiple countries across Southeast Asia, and that's what Stuart will share with us today, as well as other countries around the world. They have thus far trained 300,000 farmers, about 36% of which are women. And in Myanmar, they partner with the Mennonite Economic Development Associates to better understand the dynamics of gender in vegetable production. Stuart will also be sharing with us a bit more about the business case, but just to highlight this idea that a higher volume of safe to eat vegetables as a result of women receiving this training can have a positive impact on nutrition and food security in the communities. Then lastly, the key considerations that East West Seed has identified is to work with those community leaders to identify convenient locations for women farmers to attend trainings, and then also to make this knowledge transfer through informal discussions and social connections, and very much focusing on the community-based approach. Lastly, I'll share about PRISMA's Women Sales Agents model, which they use together with multiple partners, 9 and more to be specific, to actually develop and run this sales agents model across Indonesia. The business partners actually recruit and train these women sales agents to distribute their products and provide capacity building directly to their farming communities. There are some very clear business outcomes with this program. So we see that there's an increase in direct sales and a 91% success rate in farmers who receive these trainings, actually applying the learnings and purchasing products from women sales agents. Lastly, a few key considerations. We know that women have diverse and different needs, so the assessments that PRISMA conducts on market as well as gender dynamics and opportunity are essential. And the importance of understanding why women choose to become sales agents so that the incentives in the program can support them. And then lastly, using women-led demonstration farms to engage more women farmers. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you our 4 panelists here today, again, who represent the 3 organizations and will be able to share more detail with you about these case studies. So I'll take an opportunity now to introduce you first to Fei Chu, Asia Cocoa Director for Mars. We have Miriam Piracha, the Portfolio Advisor for Agriculture, Gender Equality, and Social Inclusion at PRISMA. We have Nisa Usman, a business consultant, also with PRISMA. And then lastly, Stuart Morris, the Director of the Knowledge Transfer Program for East West Seed. It's a pleasure to have these panelists with us here today. And I'd like to ask, if they haven't already, to just have them turn their cameras on. And we'll begin with a few questions that I will pose directly to them. And then we'll shift to Leanne, who will be asking the panelists to answer your questions from the audience. So please remember to be submitting your questions in the Q&A box below. So the first question that I have for Faye is, how did you decide to design your programs the way you did in the Mars Cocoa for Generations strategy?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so happy to be here. I am not a gender expert. I see in the participant list people who are way more knowledgeable in this space than me, but I can give you from a programmatic perspective how businesses are looking at this issue. I also want to congratulate Grow Asia on this 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action to be releasing this report. I remember my mom attended the Beijing meeting as a delegate from the Baha'i community. And in reflection, 25 years later on, whilst we have made tremendous progress in many of these spaces, I think particularly in gender equality, it's been slow and uneven. And the underlying belief that I've got is that humanity is like a bird, and it needs both wings to fly and progress. And these two wings are the male and the female. And if one wing is weak, then humanity as a collective will not be able to progress. So if you can move to the next slide, we take an ecosystems approach in our Cocoa for Generations program. So it's a holistic and integrated approach that looks at how do we transform the ecosystem, be it at the livelihood of the farming family or the thriving community that we'd like to see, or supporting infrastructures and institutions that support the cocoa sector. So, and we do understand that each of these protagonists acts on the other in this process of transformation. And we cannot achieve sustainability if we don't tackle it at all three levels. So we start always with the principle we call the farming family first at the micro level, understanding what the family needs are, motivations, aspirations, and then we go and look at the community or the meso level, and that, looking at the interactions that happens with the community, and at the institutional level, whether formal or informal, we look at some of the other enabling environments that is sometimes it's called across three, both. So I mean the three factors of social, environmental, and economic. Although we know that it looks quite nice on the chart, different factors, but actually they all interplay with each other quite integratedly. So as we mentioned, and you mentioned in the opening, it's important to understand the inequalities that exist, be it gender or youth or other inequalities. And I think ignoring these inequalities will be at peril of what we would like to achieve from a sustainable cocoa sector perspective. Empowered women and youth have the potential to transform their families. They've got potential to transform their communities and institutions that have women on the boards or in their decision making. They make better holistic decisions after consulting and considering all the perspectives that are out there. And we do realize, of course, deep structural inequalities exist at all levels. And so taking, first of all, a holistic view would be sort of, I call it step one, understanding the power dynamics and some of these maybe societal norms that puts girls in their place or youth in their place. And then if you took that approach, you'd think about root causes and not symptomatic approach, right? We have to look at the root causes of all of this. The other thing also, like anything in sustainability, we realize that all and each of us is responsible to driving this transformation. So be it at the government, community, or the family levels that we lean into, each of us have that to be the capacity for change and be the change that we want to be. I like to think about gender equality sometimes on a personal term. What are my own personal biases? I have a girl I have a daughter and a son. Am I treating them equally? Are they being given equal chance and opportunities? Are there norms in my family that somehow creates a bias of inequality? So it's always constantly being conscious and challenging ourselves that equality will come about when everyone in the community takes place, and plays a role in it. So sustainable, and clearly, obviously, at workplace or in the sustainable development space we work in, this is also a constant challenge. Next. Now, coming back to then, when we look at it from a holistic perspective, we take, if you move to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, thank you. The next step is we take a participatory, what we call a participatory human design-centered, a human-centered design thinking process, where it's about engaging with the beneficiaries or the community at large to understand, and we all know this quite well. So at the empathy stage, we've worked with KIT, the Royal Institute of Tropical studies where we start to understand who are these women, you know, and what are their daily lives, aspirations, motivations, and their life journey. You know, what is the environment they operate in? What's their daily life? What is their access to resources and services and distribution? What are the barriers, as you mentioned? Who influences them in their perspectives and decision making? Who are their role models? Who do they look up to? What is the role of boys and men in their lives and decision making, right? And so Kit introduced us to this approach that I have shared also in this the link in the which we found it very interesting. So I have to admit that we are now still at the stage of, we finished the studies, we've presented the reports publicly as well, and we're at the stage now of ideation and going back to the communities, playing it back with them to engage with them on the solutions finding as well. So I like the model that is out there that, you know, it looks at on the left, you see the framework below, it looks at empowerment of women and girls is an expansion of choice. You know, what are the options, opportunities, and ability to make and influence the choices that affect her life, you know, and strengthening of the voice, which is the capacity to speak up and to be heard at all levels, to be able to shape and share in decision-making that are being made that impacts them or their families, their communities, right? And that at the part of it is this power relationship that's happening that could be, you know, patriarchal hierarchies that exist, that could be male privilege, you know, whatever we want to call it, that ultimately we have to address it at this root cause level so that women and girls have more control over their lives and their futures, right?
Absolutely.
And then
actually,
sorry, go on.
Sorry, Faye. I was just going to say, I think that might be a great place to ask Miriam to step in, because I know PRISMA has done a lot of space in this work. And then I'll invite Faye, you to come back at the business case question. So Miriam, if you don't mind just responding for maybe 1 minute.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Faye. I think just building off on some of the work that Mars has been doing on looking at agency and women's empowerment, I think at PRISMA, what we're really encouraging and focusing is a commercially driven, evidence-based approach. What that means is that we place a lot of emphasis on consumer behavior and consumer research within the agriculture sector, where we try to really understand what are the roles of women in agriculture, what are the constraints that they're facing, what is the status quo like, and it's not just looking at women as farmers, but also women as active members of the household enterprise, as decision makers, and then really looking at all of those insights, data, and information to convert it into a business case for our partners, which include a spectrum of businesses from multinationals to national level companies to small and regional players. The importance of this approach is, again, that, Erin, you mentioned this in the beginning of your discussion, you know, by not having inclusive practices, businesses can be missing out on 50% of their customers and, you know, chances to improve their supply chain diversification and improvements in productivity along the value chain. And that's the information that PRISMA spends a lot of time understanding, assessing, and conveying that to businesses, finding the incentives about why businesses would be interested to reaching out to women and what are the different steps they can take in order to do so. Finally, yeah, and I think just to add, the type of changes businesses can have can be significant, such as women inclusive workforces, but also simple change steps, such as designing more effective promotional techniques and marketing strategies that can have an impact on reaching out to more women effectively.
Great. Thank you so much for those insights from PRISMA, Miriam, and from Faye at Mars. So I'd like to switch over and ask Stuart to talk to us a bit about how you engage women farmers in your program through the knowledge transfer work. So Stuart, let me advance to your slide.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Erin. So how we've engaged women farmers, we had it's been like a topic which has eluded us for many years, actually. And we had the very good fortune to work with MEDA in Cayenne in Myanmar, where we could take the opportunity to really look if we could make wider impact in the community through working directly through women key farmers. you know, as with any other projects that we work in, whether in Myanmar or any other country, kind of like our main objective is to increase productivity, or to train farmers in increased productivity. So we're targeting smallholder farmers who are suffering from low yields, poor qualities, etc. And we do this because we want to create an environment, a kind of a long-term environment where the private sector can be more successful in creating markets. And private sector meaning, of course, East West, our own mother company, but also many other companies benefit from that. And well, wherever we work, we have a field-based approach, and we always position key farmers as the main sort of entry point into the community. So we capacitate and we give intensive support to key farmers in communities, and we support them to have demonstrations, practical field demonstrations, which we then use as a hub to train neighboring farmers in the community. And well, we've long, I think, long recognized and long talked about the sort of the impact of gender, or the sort of the dynamics of gender, but we've never really got our heads around this. What does it really mean for us in the world of vegetables and vegetable markets? And if you look back into our past, over the past few years, our average on demonstration farms, only about 20 or 30% of the demonstration farms were hosted by women. So this project was really to try to see what would happen if we deliberately targeted a high number of women. And well, with the support of META, that's exactly what we did. In order to do that, one of the things we really needed to change is our selection process for the key farmers. And to make it more of an open process, and to, that women know that it's much more flexible, that they are aware if they take on that role as a key farmer, they are also able to manage parallel to that their usual expectations which come from their families. And with that, when women were more comfortable in becoming key farmers, we noticed a big difference in impact. So in this project, we had 50% key farmers as women, and the rate of adoption of technologies, of improved technologies, it was much quicker than in a regular knowledge transfer program for us. And well, just one note on that, the lady in the picture there, she's one of our key farmers in Cayenne, but the field behind her, that's not her own field. She actually went the extra mile, as did many other women in the project, not just hosting their own demo farm, but actually going out in the village and kind of like almost holding hands and mentoring people in the village so that they could have similar opportunities. And that was the result. It's absolutely fantastic what they did. Thanks.
That's great, Stuart. Thank you so much. And it's great to hear about these learnings directly from the field in Myanmar. So thank you. Nisa, would you like to take just 1 minute to respond to what Stuart has shared, and then we'll transition to the last question?
Sure. Yeah, I think that was very interesting. At Prisma, I think similarly we do help our partners, our business partners, to engage farmers directly so that they could more effectively engage farmers. But maybe more interestingly, we also help our partners engage different stakeholders within their own company system to kind of buy into these gender inclusive programs. But I think in general, the way to do this, or like the way to engage it both on farmers levels or like company executive levels, is really beyond just capacity buildings. It's beyond just providing gender trainings, for example, in company level, and providing agricultural activities in farmers level, but also, as Stuart has correctly mentioned earlier, that identifying the correct stakeholders, correct kind of influencers that have strong influence that can encourage a lot of other farmers or stakeholders, and then breaking down almost their visions, goals, incentives, OKR, KPR, if we're talking about the company context, and really try to tap on that, whatever that means. But yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nisa. And I then just transfer to an opportunity for Nisa, for you to share more about Prisma's commercially driven approach to gender inclusion. So we'll take a minute to hear from yourself and then from Faye and Stuart on what is the business case for gender mainstreaming anyway?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. If you could go next, I think, yeah. I think business case has always been the core approach of how Prisma does all its businesses, but particularly in gender inclusion and women empowerment, we really try to ensure that any gender inclusive strategies are commercially sound for our business partners. This is really to ensure sustainability, as Faye and Mariam already mentioned earlier, as a sustainability of the implementation, but also the impact both to our partners, but also more importantly, maybe to business partners. And to develop a sound business case, we support our business partners in understanding their customers and different customer segments a lot better. We do that by help them reveal and unearth women's involvement in the agricultural supply chains. And this is beyond collecting and analyzing demographic data. We support them in really examining farming households' decision-making journey, which will reveal a lot on how much actually different members of the household, both women and men, are involved in the agricultural-related decisions. We then help our partners utilize these insights to build marketing and sales strategies toward farmer customers that are much more cost-effective for our business partners. If you go next, Erin, so this type of approach can be implemented to all the sectors that Prisma currently works in. In the interest of time, I have two examples here. If we could go next, Erin. So the first one in the maize sector, we have supported one of our partners, Cortefa, to generate over 16,000 new farmer customers, and about half of them are women farmers. These implementations are conducted in small parts of East Java, but we currently are also supporting our partner in upscaling it to be part of the national level sustainability strategy. If we could go next, the pig sector example, we have supported our business partners there, pig feed producers, to generate over 173,000 very happy woman farmer customers, actually, that because they use these products and it decreases their workload by over 60%. And our business partners utilize over 130 woman agents, woman retailers, to help them distribute products as well as capacity building. And this type of approach is also currently copied by other businesses in the area as well. And then more recently, maybe we have consolidated our learnings, if we could go next, Erin, from across the agricultural sectors that we work in to try to understand how women sales agents programs could be improved to reach women and men farmers more effectively, and how the agent model benefits business partners. Some of the most interesting findings is that, as Erin mentioned earlier, 91% of farmers, both women and men, that are reached by women agents actually apply the advice or the knowledge that were delivered. And then also 60% or most of women farmers actually prefer women agents to deliver products and capacity building. These types of insights that Prisma actually regularly monitors, evaluates, and shares to our business partners, we believe it can be very critical for businesses as they continue to improve their strategies towards customers along all the agricultural supply chains.
Fantastic.
That's all from me.
Great. Nisa, thanks so much for sharing these multiple examples of how companies are working closely with Prisma and seeing some really impressive results. So Faye, I'd love to turn it back to you and ask you a bit about the business case for Mars.
Yeah, when people talk about business case, I'm like, why do we need a business case? Isn't it obvious? The first one that, and we talked about it, and I like that Nisa talked about joint decision-making, household decision-making. So we had this approach about putting farmers on a long-term farm development plan farming family business plan towards livelihoods, increased livelihoods. And we call it the farm development plan approach. And we were starting to quickly realize that the dynamics of how households make a decision in the Sulawesi cocoa farming community was we had to engage the women. And what we did was, so in a lot of the early planning stage, when we sit down with a family to make their plans for the future, it has to involve both men and women, because ultimately it's a joint decision making that they both commit to doing. And so we've now grown that approach with Rainforest Alliance. It's a spin-off now called Farm Grow. But I think it's the social side of it is how the approach and approaching it at the decision-making level is a critical one. We did a recent pilot with Rainforest Alliance as well and Swiss Contact on what we call gender action learning, which starts to take the farm business development or planning approach more into a paper base, but really engaging the women and men to get involved. To design what's the vision map for their future, for their family, to then break it down into steps that they can take and how, and understanding their own expenses and resources that are available to them to be able to go on that path and vision, and then to be able to then make it, break it down into smaller steps and leverage resources that's around the community that they can engage with. And we are seeing, I think the initial learnings coming out of there is very interesting for us in how we move towards a diversified income and livelihoods for farming families. The third one is also a study on youth that we did in Sulawesi youth communities using what we call the youth development assets approach. Again, the links are there if anyone is interested to go in to see. But again, understanding that the agency comes from within and sometimes also by the people around them, and where are these assets that we can all continue to tap into. Again, when you did your earlier presentation, Erin, about all the mistakes that has been made, trust me, I went there and I said, yep, did that, you know. We're learning, right? Nobody has clearly got all the answers. And yes, we are hoping that from the KID study, it will inform us going forward what the approach will take. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Faye, and we hope the same. So, Stuart, I'd love to ask you to wrap the panel section up for us with a little bit about the business case for East-West Seed, and then I'll pass it to my colleague, Leanne.
Okay, thanks, Erin. Interesting what Faye said, that it's obvious, the business case is obvious, and indeed I fully agree with that, but it's so easy to miss that, and I think that's the problem, what's been going on for years for many organizations, many companies. Sometimes the obvious is it's hidden somewhere. You need to go looking for it, or we needed to go looking for it. But once we saw it, it's changed the way we work. So yeah, we used to get a lot of questions, and we still do in the company. You know, what's it going to bring to the company, or what's it going to bring for us if we work with more women? If we train more women, will more people buy seeds, etc.? And I think that's really what we can start to piece together now. The project in Cayenne, that was about 2.5 years, if I remember rightly. And what we saw coming from there was that women key farmers, it was very much anecdotal, so it's not too scientific, but it was enough to change the way we work in the future. So what we noticed was that women key farmers were much more effective at sharing technical messages within the community. So quite often men will share the same technical message, but within the venue of a training event which we organize, then they're really good at sharing that technical message. But the women were always going that 1 mile further with it, taking it into the community more through those informal routes, which I'm not saying men don't do that, but women seemed more effective at doing that. So our conclusion was the message actually went further, and the message was more pure as it got spread around the community. It was also interesting to observe that women key farmers initially took a little bit longer to adopt some technologies. Technologies to us, it's all simple stuff like raised beds or planting distance or improved nurseries, etc. And again, anecdotal, but seemingly women take longer to accept those technologies, but when they are accepted, they're implemented with more accuracy. So the demonstration farms managed by women in general, not always, but in general, were more well maintained and had better results than demonstrations managed by men. Yeah, it was an interesting one. And then another very interesting thing, we felt that women were more market orientated. When you look at the selection of crops, there was more analytics behind it. Why do I choose cucumber? What's the market price likely to be in 2.5 months when the plant starts fruiting, etc. And well, I think one very interesting thing, actually, spent some time talking to agri-input dealers in Cayenne. I remember visiting about 5 or 6 different shops there and asking them all the same question. Like, if a man comes in, if a woman comes in buying seed, is there any difference? Do you treat them differently? Do they ask different things? And the consistent answer we got back from that, really interesting. When a woman comes in, she has in her mind which variety or which brand she wants to buy, and she will keep looking for that brand. So if, as a stockist, if I haven't got that, she will go to another shop and another shop until she finds it, if it's available. But generally men come in and they're much more easier to change their mind. So if I haven't got it in stock, then I can convince the man to take another variety of cauliflower or cabbage or whatever it is he's looking for.
Wow,
and
so
that has a big consequence, I think, for business. And well, the other interesting thing, of course, is the impact to sales. Do we know if the working with women key farmers really made an ultimate impact or a difference in our sales to working with men key farmers? We're not sure, but again, our gut feeling is definitely, or most likely, let's say, it more than doubled our sales in Cayenne within 2.5 years.
wow.
And kind of like that, the results of that, it doesn't just change the way we work in Myanmar. This is kind of like resonating in other countries in Asia and Africa where we're changing farmers. So we have a different approach now to how we train farmers because of this.
Fantastic. And that links really well, Stuart, what you just shared, to some of what we learned in the case studies, which was that there are a lot of learnings coming out of these projects that organizations are running on the ground, and you are measuring impact, both in terms of ROI, but also in terms of the impact on community and nutrition. So it's really exciting to hear from all of you on this topic. And with that, I can see that there are fantastic questions coming in through the chat. So I'll pass it over to my colleague, Leanne, who's going to ask the panelists some of your great questions. And panelists, I'll just remind you that in the meantime, there are some questions specifically for each of you. So you can go ahead and answer those by typing directly into the Q&A box while others are responding. Leanne, over to you.
Thanks so much, Erin. So thank you all so much for the questions. I'm having a look in the Q&A section, and there have already been quite a few really good questions. So maybe we'll start with the first question, and the questions will always be general questions feel free for any of the panelists to just jump in if you would like to respond to the question. So the first question is, how much does the customer's sustainable consumption influence the companies to be more gender responsive? And would anyone like to jump in?
Leanne, maybe I can begin with that.
Sure.
Sure. Of course, I think the starting point for any of the analysis or the work that we do with private businesses is understanding the demand pattern or the consumption trends. And for that, for us to ensure that there's sustainable demand or consumption arising is an important factor that would help the businesses incentivize that they need to invest further in their supply chains and improving their productivity or adding value across the value chain. Another point that we've also looked at is for some companies, brand reputation and sort of enhanced images is also important. So you'd also see a lot of agribusiness companies and companies in other sectors as well, wanting to be more inclusive, wanting to have more inclusive practices across their organization. And that is also an entry point that can help influence or transform the business to be more inclusive with some gender specific practices. So yes, in short, definitely an important factor to consider as we design these models.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miriam. I guess maybe the next question, someone has asked, apart from the general promoting of women's agency, how have you in your companies and organizations and in your projects also been trying to address some of the wider socioeconomic structural barriers, for example, gender norms in societies, increasing women's ownership of assets, resources, and reducing gender-based violence.
I probably don't answer this very well, but I just would like to say from our side, we're not trying to change everything. We're looking for entry points which we can make an impact from our side. So there's many other issues, but there's also many other stakeholders out there. And you can't cope with everything under kind of like one project usually.
Yeah, I will just maybe build on that. We're not, we as a business or as whilst we look at it at an ecosystem level, we have to prioritize the interventions that we want to be focused on. And I think taking a science-based approach where we hear from the communities and then prioritizing and saying that's where we're going to work on. So we were intentional about working with youth. And that led us to an outcome of the report. And I know that some people from Save the Children are all here, is we do know that there is there are some issues around early marriages in among the youth community that then has a cyclical effect to women then drop out of school, their children and their families have, it's a embedded in, and the poverty is perpetuated into the next generation. Whilst we all know that if girls remain in schools for longer, the future, the livelihoods of their families is impacted, so on and so forth. So now having said that, then we step back and say, okay, if that's the case, and we are working, knowing that today, how do we now work with the vocational schools and the other entrepreneurship skills that we would work with these youth to enable them to better access to, financial or other business skills that they could grow and nurture. So I think if we understood these norms and these biases and these power, plays that happens in the communities, that would allow us to take a much more broader view and a much more targeted approach. Again, we're not trying to save the world. We can't. Our resources are limited. And so we have to be very specific to what is it we believe is the best intervention and how might we consider it in light of these norms and biases.
Thank you so much, Faye and Stuart.
Leanne.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Nisa.
Yeah, I think I'm just echoing what Faye and Stuart said. While we cannot do everything in PRISMA, at least we try to at least monitor some of these externalities impact through our women's economic empowerment impact assessments. We regularly conduct this. We started conducting it last semester, but we have 6 dimensions that we spread over 17 different indicators, both quantitative and qualitatively, to kind of try to see these other impacts that are beyond our intervention main goals. So hopefully kind of try to address what are the hopefully positive, if any, but negative externalities, and can try to address that also.
Thank you so much, Nisa. Maybe we'll move on to the final 2 questions, and maybe due to time, let's try to keep the answers a bit more succinct. Maybe for the next question, if any one of you could share, based on your experience working in these projects, what was the most effective way to address some maybe resistance you have received during the implementation of these projects for these target communities? Yeah.
I think maybe if I can just begin, I think generally resistance begins again with one, not knowing exactly what is the role of women. So just having more clarity on using an evidenced approach, having the data to see how women are engaged in the value chain that you work in the sector that you operate in, and influence your business model and hopefully your bottom line at the end of the day. I think showing those insights and data can be very effective. And we've had several examples where they've actually helped the conversation and the engagement. And I think secondly, another important factor when working with businesses, of course, is looking at how this data can be explained in business metrics, in business terminology. So, we're not just talking about development jargon and say women's sort of agency, etc., which are important features, of course, but also translating it into what does it mean for a business at the end of the day, and how does it intervene with the market realities that we all work as part of.
Yeah, I'd fully agree with that. There's a lot of, I wouldn't say, maybe not a lot, but there's always a certain amount of resistance internally, I guess in every organization. I can say that within our own organization, within our local teams. And people need to understand what is the rationale behind it. If we can really go with the flow of gender dynamics, what's it going to bring for us? And once people get the picture of that, things really change. So there's a lot from our side to really educate our own teams on what it really means.
Thank you so much, Miriam and Stuart. For the next question, so beyond the impact on the farm, maybe what are some other benefits that you can share that you see in the communities on a broader scale when we improve the capabilities and capacities of these women farmers? Yep, anyone like to take this question?
I think maybe I can start. Following on from what Nisa mentioned, one of the work that we do is a lot of monitoring and ongoing measurement about looking at how women benefit economically within their households, but also non-economically. So some of the things that we are now starting to track and monitor is seeing how, as a result of better information services, women can influence the decision-making process within the household, and also what does that mean for her role within the community. So some of those topics around social norms, and I don't talk about social norms like at a country level, because I think Faye mentioned that we need to contextualize it and break it down. What does it mean for the local context, the local culture, and how do some of these new models that we're introducing slowly start influencing or changing some of the existing prevailing norms and almost challenging the status quo that are in place about the role women have to play in agriculture. So definitely, I think topics around or indicators around social norms, women's involvement, engagement in communities, women's contribution as community leaders are indicators within our women's economic empowerment framework that we monitor, capture, and use to develop these business case implications and improve our models further.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And actually, that's really great to lead on to another question that someone has asked, and maybe someone else can take this question. Someone has asked, what kind of impact measurement reportings do you use when you implement these projects or plan to implement?
I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, what we look at is the impact in vegetable markets. We're looking at increase in income. So you look at productivity, income increase, and the increase of safe to eat vegetables on the market. So consistent supply of better quality vegetables on the markets. And then if you translate on, you can look at the income increase with the men and the women in the community. We're still developing that one, I would say, splitting that between men and women in the community. We have key farmers we can track very closely, very accurately. So whether they're men or women, we have the data there. The farmers we train, we do broader surveys, and we would like to head towards that we can start to see, is there a difference? Is that increase in income bigger on the side of women?
Thank you so much, Stuart. And I think with that, I think we should end the Q&A section of the webinar. And I apologize if we were not able to answer every question due to time constraints, but I hope that we managed to provide some food for thought and that you've learned something from our wonderful panelists. So I'll now pass it back to Erin to present the recommendations.
Great, thank you so much to Leanne and to our panelists. I know there were questions that we didn't have time to get to, and particularly that last question around measuring impact is really important. But some of the recommendations that we received in the report, I think may actually lead to being able to answer some of these questions over time, both perhaps this year and in future years. But we'll also give the panelists an opportunity now to answer any of those individual questions that might have been specifically for each of them while I'm going through this next short section. So an overall recommendation that BSR gave to us is really focused on how GrowAsia needs to focus on these unique selling points that we already have in order to make sure that we're building on our strengths and not duplicating any of the fantastic work that already exists. In fact, they suggested that we should really focus on disseminating, evaluating, and synthesizing all of the content and knowledge from our partners in the region, as well as those who we haven't yet been able to partner with, so that we can better help bridge the gap between the different stakeholders that are working to advance gender equality in the region. So this will inform all of our work going forward. I'm now going to share with you a series of recommendations from the report at several different timelines, and then we're going to give you a chance to respond to polls to let us know what you think about them quite quickly. So I'll go through these fairly quickly and then let me know what you think, and we'd like your honest feedback. So recommendations for the immediate future: publishing a baseline report to demonstrate key barriers to the adoption of gender mainstreaming practices and policies, which is not detailed in the landscape mapping report that we just did. The second is to form a gender mainstreaming community of practice that facilitates cross-learning across all of these different stakeholders, and it facilitates an exchange of good practices. So to the point that so many of these questions from all of you have been about trying to learn from each other, we wonder if this idea of pulling together a community of practice that meets at any kind of more regular pace would be of interest to all of you on the call today. And then lastly, in the immediate future, to facilitate partner connections to implement projects on the ground. And that is something that we're already doing at the country level as well as at the regional level with several partners. In the short term, the next 1 to 2 years, we'd like to first focus on identifying opportunities for our partners to invest either financially or in kind in programs that support women's access to finance and access to technology specifically, because we keep hearing that this is a real challenge in Southeast Asia across the board. And we would be able to provide those opportunities and details to our partners. The second is this idea of an online inventory of existing resources that can support more both private sector and our other NGO, CSO, and government partners in developing relevant gender equality policies and strategies. So to make that available to everyone publicly. And then lastly, to develop and then publish a what works and what's needed report. Again, I think that this recommendation might help to answer some of these questions where we're getting very specific suggestions from our partners, and we would survey a range of partners from across our whole network every year. And we'd also include a review of those impact metrics and measurement systems that our partners are using to understand the impact of their work. Then lastly, in the longer term, and this gets to some of the good questions that I saw in the chat, particularly about what's next for the region and how can we influence policy. So first, to consider that the GrowAsia Network actually tried to define what meaningful impact looks like based on the previous work from the earlier years, and set aspirational targets and goals that all of our partners can align to. The second, to seek long-term funding for our PPP approaches to scale programs that impact women, to move from pilot programs to implementing these projects across multiple countries in Southeast Asia. And then lastly, to support ASEAN policy advancements, perhaps by bringing recommendations directly from our community of practice, as well as promoting representation of women in leadership and being able to test scalable and replicable solutions that we are finding in our network. So I know that's a lot. So I've put it together into a table for your convenience. And what we'll do now is actually launch a poll and be able to ask you what you think about the suggestions that I've just put forward. So Leanne, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Erin. So just to repeat what Erin said, you should see on your screen a poll that has 3 questions. We hope that you answer all 3 of the questions, and each are on the various timelines in terms of recommendations for the report. So maybe we'll just take some time for everyone to just put in your answers, and then we'll take a look at the results of the poll together.
And please don't hesitate to share with us if you think that any of these ideas need considerable adjustment. We are not attached to these ideas in any way. It's a fantastic list of opportunities that VSR gave us, but we'd love to hear your honest feedback. And this is what we'll be asking you to share in some detail just after you finish submitting your responses on the survey. So once we get enough of you voting, we'll be able to identify those areas that you've told us need considerable adjustment, and then I'll actually ask you to even unmute yourselves to share with us your thoughts.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Erin.
I can see our count of respondents going up, and I'm thrilled that we still have so many folks on the line. So it looks like we may need a few more seconds to give everyone a chance to submit your votes. Fantastic. Maybe we'll give 15 more seconds for the final few submissions to our polls. We do want to hear from as many of you as would like to respond. Fantastic. So it looks like we can see that in the immediate action category, the recommendations are largely appropriate. That's good to hear, but a few people did say it needs some considerable adjustment. Slightly fewer people said largely appropriate for our short-term actions, and then quite similar number around the long-term action recommendations. So I'll leave these polls up for just a minute to explain what we're going to do next. We do want to hear from you why you think some of these ideas need considerable adjustment, but also to let you know that we are going to be asking some of you where you've agreed to give us deeper feedback on these ideas so that we can figure out exactly which ones we should be moving forward on, simply for the sake of time today. So we can stop sharing these results. Thank you so much. And we'll now move on to that roundtable discussion. It's going to be quite quick. So if you're able to see the raise hand function on the panels on the side, that's how you'll be able to unmute yourself to share your thoughts. But you can also put any of your thoughts into the chat box if you prefer that way. So what we'll do is that I'll ask my Grow Asia colleague to unmute you if you raise your hand, and then I'll say your name so that you know it's your opportunity to speak. And what I'd love to do now is hear from you, from those of you who said that the ideas and the immediate feature needed some considerable adjustment. Would you please raise your hand and share with us your thoughts, and perhaps even let us know if you know that there is someone else or another organization already doing this great work. And if you prefer not to raise your hand and unmute, you are very welcome to put your thoughts into the comment box. If I don't see any hands, aha. So I can see one raised hand. You're unmuted now, and go ahead.
Erin, I think it was an accident. They put their hand down quite quickly.
All right, understandable. I know it's a little bit odd in a webinar to raise one's hand, and so I understand that completely. We do have a minor comment about the baseline report on key barriers and opportunities. Yes, that's great, Wendy, I agree. We'll definitely add that in. Are there any other comments that anyone would like to submit either in the chat box or in the panel bar on the side by raising your hand? please feel free to share any of those directly in the comment box. But as I said, our intention with these recommendations is not to simply launch forward with them, but rather to prepare to move forward as we're also gathering feedback from many of you. So I'll let you perhaps take a few more minutes to consider your thoughts on this overview of recommendations and add anything into the comment box. But I also know that the purpose of today's webinar was to make sure that you do get a chance to actually access this report and you can read the recommendations at your leisure. We have two beautifully designed tables at the back, so you can take your time to look through the recommendations and then give us feedback that way. So I think with that, I'll actually turn it back over to my colleague, Leanne, who will ask you to give a chance to take a few more polls, and then I promise we will give you access to the report. Leanne?
Thank you so much, Erin. And just to reiterate what she said, before we move on to the closing of the webinar, we would just like to take a few final moments to do a few polls to get a feel of how you, the participants, felt about today's webinar. So the first poll you should see on your screen should pop up right now. And we'll just take a few moments for you to key in your answer for that. So it's about whether We Grow Asia can reach out to you to potentially support the delivery of the recommendations. And we'll just take a few more seconds for that. All right, thank you everyone. And then now let's launch the second poll and the final poll. It should pop up on everyone's screen fairly shortly. There we go. And we'll again take another moment for you to answer this one as well.
I'll jump in here just to add that we do plan that this is not a one-off event. We were very thrilled to have the 4 panelists that joined us here today, but we know many of you have a lot of expertise in this space as well. So we do plan to hold future events and engage others of you. And again, if we do get enough support to move forward on this idea of a community of practice, then that community would also be able to design and hold events where we can dive deeper into some of the fantastic questions that all of you asked here today.
Thanks so much for that, Erin. And now that we're done with the final polls, we can now finally move on to the grand finale and reason for this whole webinar, which is we'll be sharing with you the link to the actual report. So feel free to scan the QR code or copy the link to be able to read the report in your own time. So we'll just take a few moments for that. And additionally, in the next slide, we'll have the email and contact information for Erin. So if you have any questions or follow-up conversations you would like to have, please feel free to email Erin, or if you'd like to collaborate with Grow Asia as well. So her contact information will be on the next slide. Here we go. Perfect. Just take a few moments. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. That brings this webinar to a close. Again, thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. Really, really appreciate it from all of us here at Grow Asia. So you may now feel free to log off. Thank you once again, everyone. Have the great rest of the day wherever you may be in the world.